Hello to everybody, I'm Marco Beato, Associate Professor in Sport and Exercise Science at University of Suffolk. Welcome to this new episode of Understanding Sports Science with Andrea Riboli. Today, our guest is Andrea, that is a professional fitness coach with a lot of experience in Serie A. Thank you very much, Andrea, to have accepted our invitation.
Thank you for your invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
You can start, Andrea, when you want. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Today, I will speak with you about some of our latest findings about the use of small-sided games and about how to manage the pitch size during small-sided games. As a strength and conditioning, our work is to try to enhance individual performance in elite soccer players and try to reduce the gap between match demands and training demands. So we need to work every day to try to reduce this gap between these two parts. In this first graph, I would highlight you some of our findings, some of our analysis about the external load during different small-sided game format. We analyzed more than 155 different small-sided game format and more than 3,000 individual samples. In this graph, you can see on x-axis different metrics: total distance, high-speed running, very high-speed running, sprint, and acceleration. Each circle is a different small-sided game format, and within each circle, there are a lot of different measures of the same format of small-sided games. On y-axis, you can see a percentage with regard to match demands. The horizontal dotted line is the 90-minute average match demands, and as you can see over soccer routine, in daily soccer routine uses small-sided game, the intensity, especially for very high-speed running, but mainly for very high-speed running and sprint, are lower than match demands. This information comes with different teams and different clubs, so these are a picture of what is usual during a small-sided game in elite soccer. I would highlight you that the average area per player was utilized in small-sided game was about 159 meters square per player. This information should be considered this information for the next slides. So we decided to share a practical information with our coaches. We try to create some research project using a link between area per player and external load during different formats of small-sided game, trying to consider the relationship between pitch size and external load. Our aim was mainly to have a practical information about the minimal area per player required to replicate match demands using small-sided game. So we intersected the individual match demands in the equation corresponding the equation related to the relationship between external load and area per players. So the aim of our study was to share this practical information for our coaches. What we found. In this first graph, you can see the area per player during small-sided game to replicate the high-speed running. We analyze both small-sided game with goalkeeper and small-sided game possession play. The black bar are small-sided game without goalkeeper, so small-sided game possession play. As you can see, we should utilize about 160 meters square per player to replicate match demands for high-speed running using small-sided game possession play. The white bar highlight that we need to use about 260 meters square per player to replicate high-speed running using small-sided game with goalkeepers. We found a significantly higher area per player using goalkeeper due to a higher tactical organization that decreased the external load demands and so require a greater pitch size to replicate match demands using small-sided games. For sprint, we found that for both small-sided game possession play and small-sided game with goalkeeper, we need about 300 meters square per player, so a significantly higher pitch size than that required to replicate high-speed running. And it is interesting to highlight that the HARA per player during official match demands is about 340 meters square per player. So a HARA per player similar to that required during official match demands is needed to replicate sprint distances using small size game, both with or without goalkeepers. Recently, we investigated also the HARA per player to replicate match demands in youth soccer players from under 15 to under 19. We collected a lot of different individual observations across more than 400 different small set game formats in each categories. And what we found that there was, for very high speed running and sprinting, there was a very large correlation between the HARA per player and the external load. So for sure, we need to increase the pitch size to increase the external load. While for acceleration and deceleration, we found an inverse small correlation between the HARA per player and the external load. So to manage our training load using small set game, we need for sure to increase the pitch size to increase the external load demand, while for acceleration and deceleration, the intensity was quite similar using both small or large-sided games. But the main aim of our work also in youth soccer players was to try to have information about the HARA per player required to replicate match demands. So we investigate this aspect in whole categories, and we found that for replicate very high speed running, we needed about 200 meters square per players to replicate very high speed running using small sided games in these young players, while to replicate sprint, we need about more than 200 meters square per players, while for acceleration and deceleration, 160 and 56 meters square per player. So we need to take into account that about 200 meters square per players also in young players are required to replicate average match demands. Interestingly, we found a higher pitch size required in younger players under 15 and under 16, probably due to a lower neuromuscular capacity in this player that require a large space to reach peak velocity. And so this should be considered when we work across different age categories and when we work from under 15, under 16 until under 19. In the previous paper, in the previous research, we highlight how to replicate the 90-minute average match demands. But as proposed in other sports, we recently investigated the rolling average analysis in Serie A soccer players. On x-axis, you can see different time windows from 90 minutes to 15 minutes, 5 minutes, or 1 minute during match demands. And we found that for sure the intensity during 5-minute period was higher than the average match demands. And for short period of 1 minute, our players perform a significantly higher intensity for high intensity running distances than 90-minute average. So I would highlight that, for example, the 1 minute peak, the comparison between 1 minute peak, the intensity, the external load demand during 1 minute peak with regard in comparison with 90-minute average match demands was significantly higher for each matrix, for total distance, high speed running, sprint, and acceleration, deceleration, and mainly for high speed running and sprint. So at least 4 times higher or 6 times higher for sprint and high speed running distances in 1 minute than 90-minute average. And so we need to take into account this aspect because as we know, the very high intensity running and sprint are metrics very related with the performance development, but also injury prevention. Therefore, We investigate how to manage the pitch size and the area per play uses small set game to replicate 90-minute average. But in training routine, we need to consider that small set game lasts a few minutes and usually 3, 4, or 5 minutes. So we decided to investigate also the area per player to replicate not only 90-minute average, but also 4-minute peak. So the most demanding passage of match play across a similar duration. So we compare the 4-minute peak during the matches with the intensity of small-sided game, with the aim to suggest the area per player to replicate 4-minute peak using small-sided games. Therefore, we perform a similar relationship between area per player and external load, but not only highlighting the intersection point and the area per player required to replicate 90-minute average, but also the area per player to replicate 4-minute peak. We investigated both small-sided game with goalkeepers and small-sided game without goalkeepers, but today I summarize you some information about the use of small-sided games with goalkeepers. What we found that to replicate 90-minute average match demands, we need about 200 to 250 meters square per players to replicate very high speed running, and a little bit higher area per player, near to 300 meters square per players to replicate sprinting. But if we use, for example, 4 minutes small-sided games, and we want to replicate the 4-minute peak we need to utilize a significantly higher area per players, a area per player near to the average area per player usually required during official match demands, because the area per player required during official match demands is about 340 meters square per player. So we need to increase the pitch size if we want to replicate the 4-minute peak using small-set game of a similar duration. Therefore, we found that in small-sided game routine, in practical routine using small-sided games, about 160 meters square per player are usually utilized in small-sided games. But to replicate for high-speed running distances, to replicate the 90-minute average match demand, we need about 260 meters square per player. But if we want to consider the pitch size to replicate the 4-minute peak, for example, we need a area per player significantly higher, near to the area per player usually required during official match demands. Therefore, if we cannot manage the area per player due to technical or tactical purposes, we need to consider that different rule modification, positional drills, or running-based exercises should be utilized as a supplemental activities to increase the external load and to increase the demand to conditioning our player for match demands. Recently, we try to investigate also some information that could be useful to manage the positional exercises in our player, because when is required to create some supplemental activities, we need also to have an idea about how many time spent our player at different intensity during match demands. So we create a relationship between a different percentages than 1-minute peak and the time spent in minute at different percentages than 1-minute peak. So 100 is the 1-minute peak, and then we highlight the time spent at different percentages. The gray area highlight the time at intensity higher than 90-minute average. And we found that for sprint, about 95% of the total distance covered in sprint was performed at intensity higher than average match demands. We found that about the intensity in meter per minute in the gray area was significantly higher than the average match demands. And we found, interestingly, that 300 and 82 meters, so about 95% of the total distance covered in sprint was performed in about 21 minutes during official matches. So we need to consider not only the average match demand, not only about 54 minutes of effective time during official matches, but we need to consider that, for example, sprint activities were covered in about 21 minutes. So we need to take into account this information for our whole training session, training load prescriptions. I give you an example on how this information could be utilized to prescribe individual positional exercise. For example, we can decide to use an intensity higher than 80% of 1 minute peak. We can consider that the time spent at this intensity during official matches was from 4 to 6 minutes. We cover between 150 to 228 meters at this intensity, with a meter per minute, so an intensity between 24 and 42. So we can consider this information to plan, for example, we did in our practice as a minimum of 4 to 6 repetition of 1 minute at intensity between 34 meters per minute to 42 meters per minute of sprint during our practice. So we can consider the information coming from the distribution of match activities with regard to 1 minute peak to create some supplemental activity, for example, positional drills or other running-based exercise, and we have an example of the intensity and the minimum requirement during official matches at this intensity. Therefore, concluding, we realize that training routine usually utilize a lower pitch size than is required to replicate 90-minute average, and mainly the higher per player required to replicate the 4-minute peak. So we need to consider a different training load management uses more static game. We need to manage the higher per player to increase or try to increase or replicate the average match demand, or the most demanding of match play of 4 minutes in duration. Otherwise, we can consider the distribution of match intensity to plan some supplemental activities such as positional drills or running-based exercise to manage our training load during practice. I want to thank you. You can find any contact if you are interested in more information. I want to thank Marco and University of Suffolk for their invitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you very much for your presentation. It has been a pleasure to listen about your research. You've done a lot of studies in the last few years, so congratulations, really well done. So I have 3 questions for you. One is, say, a bit generic, is do you think that, say, a small side game like they are generally proposed, so I could say using a smaller size, for example, 100 meters square, 110 meters squares, that is generally the rule in many papers, you find that, are them adequate for the development of high-speed running, sprinting training in football, or based on your studies, there is no hope for that dimension? We need to really increase the size, and that is the only way, say, to implement high-speed running, sprint training in football in this specific scenario.
Okay, for sure, as I try to highlight you with our study, to replicate a very high speed running and sprinting, we need to utilize very large pitch size. So we need to increase the higher per player during small sided games. And usually small pitch sizes are preferred sometimes for technical purposes. So we need to take into account that small pitch sizes are required for different aspects, a different issue, for example, to increase the technical aspect using small sided game. But for sure, if you want to recreate or overload a very high speed running distances or sprint distances using small sided games, we need for sure to increase pitch sizes near to the higher per player usually utilized during official matches. These aspects are highlighted also by other publications that highlight that also the interplayer distances during small-sided game were similar to that required during official match demands in large pitch sizes. And so we can consider for a technical aspect small pitch size, but if you want to replicate especially physical aspect, we need to use very large pitch sizes.
Perfect, thank you. So have you found also differences in internal load parameters when you have done your analysis? So obviously the external load is much higher when you increase the size of the pitch, but what about internal load or, for example, RP when we talk about perception? Have you had this opportunity to analyze that?
Okay, these papers were mainly based on external load, and we highlight as a limitation the use of internal load because sometimes it's not easy with the elite player to use every day a thoracic band for a train monitor, and especially it's not simple to utilize RP after every drill. So we can utilize RP after the training session, but after every drill is not easy. But usually we utilize our trade, so I can give you a practical experience and not a scientific experience because we did not consider internal load. But for sure, internal load is very important, is another aspect that we should consider. And in our experience, but also considering different review paper already published, heart rate could be higher, also small pitch size, but is quite similar both in small and large pitch sizes. So the actor that could be more managed using RP player are very high speed running and sprinting. So if you want to have both external load and internal load at very high intensity using small-sided games, we should utilize very large pitch sizes than RP players. If we want to increase technical demands but maintaining a high heart rate, we can try to use also small pitch sizes.
Perfect. Thank you. I have the last question, and after I need to thank you for your time. So in the case that, for example, after a training session or during the microcycle, you and the other sports scientists see that, for example, the target wasn't reached and there is the necessity to do something a bit more. What are the other the other training methods that you recommend to hit the target when, for example, your training with a small size game doesn't work?
Okay. It depends. I give you an idea about our experiences. It depends from for example, from the aim of each training session, but we have different possibilities. The first one is to try to use the live monitoring to manage the pitch sizes or the external load during different drills directly on the pitch during our training prescription. Otherwise, we can consider to create some supplementary activities at the end or in the middle of each small-sided games during the training session to increase the external load. Or we can consider also to replicate or to increase the external load for such metrics in the day after, if you cannot reach our target in the actual training session. So we have different possibilities, and usually we utilize or rules modification in live, or pitch size modification in live, or supplemental positional exercises or running-based exercises during the session when required, and the same also if we decide to recreate some, for example, sprint training or sprint activities in the day after. It depends for sure from them.
Thank you, Andrea. Honestly, your answer is clear. Thank you very much for obviously your time. I would like obviously to thank you for your presentation on our channel, Understanding Sports Science, and for the clarification and honestly all the evidence that you gave us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure.